Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Again, we are easing like a fat man into a warm bath into actual sort of like on the news kind of stuff. But today's not the day for too much of that. But counter programming month is coming to an end, but it'll be in our hearts for all time. I'm very excited about our guest, my guest today. He's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a senior editor at City Journal, venerable publication, and a contributor, which is the real star in his cap. We have to be clear. He is a contributor to the Dispatch, and I'm talking to Charles Fain Lehman. Charles, welcome to the Remnant.
Thanks so much for having me on. I had lots of friends who were excited that I was doing the show.
It tells me a great deal about your friends.
Well, actually, what happened is that several of them texted me and were like, "Do you know that Jonah Goldberg talked about your Substack article for like 10 minutes on his podcast?" And I was like, "I did not know that, but now I do." So.
Yeah. Well, so why don't we start there? So, like, one of the reasons why I talked about it is that, I don't know if you know this about me, but like, I'm kind of like that reporter who, from the old Hulk television series, who was obsessed with proving to the world that the Hulk was real and no one would believe him. I am like at the top of the list of obsessives who thinks that the neoconservatives were not about foreign policy, but were about domestic. Yeah, right. So when you made that point, it warmed the cockles of my heart, and I felt like I wasn't alone. Like someone had heard my radio signals to Alpha Centauri and beamed them back. So why don't you sort of lay out what prompted you to get to that, to make that point, and how you see sort of the state of do-goodery public policy these days?
Yeah. Well, and so my proximate interest in the topic. I mean, so my immediate interest in the topic is the essay that you talked about, which is this new Substack publication, The Argument, which is sort of being center left. They aren't abundance neoliberals, but they really are. It's fine. And they one of their opening pieces was about the evidence that unconditional cash transfers, these randomized controlled trials that evaluate the effectiveness of something that's sort of like a UBI, but not exactly a UBI.
Okay, we're going to do a little terminology stuff for
Yes.
the normies out there.
A universal basic income.
Yes, okay. It's giving money to people that just says, thank you for having a beating heart.
Yes, and there are a bunch of big studies. That's what happens when you give people money. Where we randomize it so that some people get the money and some people don't get money, and they're randomly selected otherwise, so you can discern what the effect is of giving them money. And it turns out across several very, very large studies, the answer is very little happens, except they have some more money, and also they work slightly less. And that's a pretty shocking result to people who were convicted of the idea that all of the pathologies that go with poverty are mostly a function of poverty, as opposed to being a correlate of poverty that's caused by some other set of underlying factors.
Right. They think the causation of various dysfunctions or problems is poverty. And then there's this sort of more of our point of view, which is that the dysfunctions and problems are the causes of their poverty. So it's a causation correlation. It's which way do the causal arrows go kind of question.
Precisely. So, my response to this was basically there's actually this whole tradition that emerged in social policy in the space of, what we sometimes call domestic policy, but public policy about social problems, that 50 years ago recognized this problem and recognized these sort of counterintuitive results, and pointed to or grew out of a whole body of empirical work that said actually a bunch of social policy interventions that liberals would predict should work don't work. What's going on there? And the term for that group of people is neoconservatives, right? Like that is who those people were before it referred to the guys at the Weekly Standard who were strongly in favor of the war in Iraq. It referred to a prior generation of neoconservatives who were interested in a completely different. I mean, they were interested in foreign policy. The relevant magazines wrote about foreign policy. Dan Patrick Moynihan, who's a neoconservative, big foreign policy guy who's in the UN for a long time. But their sort of like motivating thing was the failures of social policy in the 1960s
Right. What
60s.
made them neoconservative was the social policy stuff.
Right, right.
And that's what drove them to the right because they were following the data. And just again, I'm an obsessive about this. The first and only neoconservative policy journal in the 1960s was not about foreign policy. It was strictly about domestic policy, and that was the public interest.
Right.
Okay.
And I feel like I should say, you must have listeners under the age of 25. I actually, my more long-term interest in this came out
There are
of
dozens of them.
Yeah, well, I teach a class for the Hertog Political Studies program. I've done it now for 3 summers. It's a great program. You can get a stipend if you're a college student to come to DC and listen to people like me talk at you for 8 weeks, 6 weeks, something like that. But the class is a week that's basically an introduction to the neoconservatives. So there are people trying to keep that flame alive. And my interest in the neoconservative perspective, and I come at it, I would not describe myself as following the same intellectual trajectory as the neoconservatives.
Right.
Like I was never a Trotskyist. I was a high school libertarian, and then I sort of figured out that like you need, to use the remnant friendly phrasing, you need virtue in order to attain freedom, right? It's like sort of the fusionist thesis. But I think the power of the neoconservative argument in a nutshell is a lot of these guys were very effective at persuading not just sort of the conservative base, not just sort of the core voting bloc of the movement, but mainstream American society that conservative critiques of social policy were correct and that conservative solutions were appropriate to the problems that we were facing in social policy in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And this gets to your point. I think that, and we can talk about this, but when you asked about do-gooder social policy, I think there is still a tremendous amount of support for 1960s, 1970s style social policy. The same sets of lines that got rolled out in the 60s and 70s about the root causes of crime, the root causes of dysfunction, the root causes of drug use, they come back over and over and over again. They are prominent in our public discourse today. They are often accepted basically uncritically. And a lot of what I try to do, and what many of my colleagues in the Manhattan Institute try to do, a lot of what we try to do is say, actually, those narratives are completely backwards. They have no basis in empirical reality. There's lots of evidence to support our views, and the that doesn't mean social policy can't do anything. That doesn't mean it isn't noble to try to make things better using policy, but it is much harder than many sort of do-gooders expect it to be, and they will continue to fail in predictable ways until they sort of like start to wrap their heads around how the world actually works. That's like a 10,000-foot view answer.
Yeah, no, look, I agree with that, and we should probably get off neocons because my listeners have heard me talk about neocons way too much. But just for the record, most neocons were never Trotskyists either. It's like Daniel Patrick Moynihan wasn't,
right?
Myron
Wilson.
Magnet wasn't. Anyway, but we also should. I'm trying very hard these days to steelman people I disagree with a little bit and kind of sort of understand where they're coming from. And we should say that, at least this is my impression. Tell me if I'm wrong. One of the reasons why, first of all, the UBI idea has had many people on the right in favor of it at one point or other. My friend Charles Murray wrote a whole book on UBI, which I was never wholly into. In part because it was his deal was we should get rid of the existing welfare state and replace it with a UBI. And no one on the left would ever agree to getting rid of the welfare state. They just wanted the welfare state plus the UBI, which is just sort of crazy to me. But anyway, but one of the reasons why people think it's, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression was that one of the reasons why people think the UBI stuff should work isn't just because of these philosophical priors about poverty, but also because direct cash payment philanthropy in the third world, often, not always, but often, there are a lot of studies that say it does work. And I think the problem there is that there's a vast difference between extreme poverty, where like getting $1 more a day gets you enough calories to live, and cash payments in an advanced westernized industrial economy where your problems aren't just sort of finding food or antibiotics and that kind of thing.
Right. No, and there are analogies to this in the American context. If you look at the early studies of universal pre-K, for example, the Abecedarian study, the early studies of Head Start, they yield these like very large benefits. And if you sort of look under the hood, we're talking about in the 60s, early 70s, if you look under the hood, a lot of what is happening is just we were in a time as a country where there were kids who could not get adequate access to basic nutrition,
Mm-hmm.
and the government was providing them with basic nutrition. And if you get basic nutrition as a child, you will be smarter and more capable
Yeah.
when you grow up. Like that is biologically true. But we live in a really rich society. Like many people struggle with poverty in America, depending on how you define it. It is certainly not the case that everyone lives a wonderful life in America, but the pathologies that are today associated with poverty are much more nuanced and indirect than they were even when the Great Society was getting started, right? If you think of the history of the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson, when he was president, why did he want to implement all of these large scale wealth transfer and other social policy interventions? Part of it is that he was concerned about the plight of Black Americans, but part of it is that he read books like Michael Harrington's The Other America, which is about the plight of Americans in Appalachia, who were living without electricity, without modern conveniences even for the 1960s, who lived these profoundly deprived lives. He's like, this should not be happening in 20th century America, and he wanted to do something about it. That is mostly not the situation for the overwhelming majority of Americans anymore. The canonical example I think about is like poverty and obesity are now associated in a way that they would not be in a much poorer society. And like
Right.
obesity leads to all sorts of terrible outcomes, and you want to do something about it, but like you're not starving if you're obese. And so it is, to the extent that there is sort of low hanging nutritional or other sort of simple intervention, lead in the water. If you get the lead out of the water, that helps. If you can get access to baby formula, that helps. Sort of like simple interventions. There's a lot of that low hanging fruit in the developing world. And so, if you give people cash so they can get vaccines or clean water or more food, that will really help. But that is not the situation. We have picked all the low hanging fruit by virtue of our wealth. And so as a result, the set of problems are much more deeply entrenched. The phrase that I was trying to evocative, from stick with neocons for a second, is Daniel Patrick Moynihan's concept of the tangle of pathology,
Mm-hmm.
that describing the condition of the American quote unquote underclass has much more to do with sort of these complex intersecting sets of institutions, behaviors, and other dysfunctions, all of which redound to result in uh, underlying, this appearance of dysfunction, this underlying cultural problem, or this set of issues. That is very different from I don't have enough food, and so I'm going to starve unless I get enough food.
So, one of the recurring themes on here has been my abiding frustration with um, with the sort of democratic political machines. And I think the problem is as much about just the nature of political machines or one party systems than it is about Democrats versus Republicans. There was a lot of dysfunction when Republican machines existed. But the point is that, and I'll often quote Nat Glazer, another neocon, um, who has this great line where he said, and I'm just paraphrasing it, that the problem, and he was always a Democrat, and he was always, sort of a quasi man of the left, even though he was the co-editor of the Public Interest for a long time. But Nat said, the problem is we've stopped doing the things that we know how to do in pursuit of the things that we don't know how to do. And he was talking basically about urban policy, and very much like the ungovernable city stuff as well. And like urban liberalism, the Democratic Party is the party of urban liberalism, right? And its inability to do the sort of nuts and bolts things required to run a city are really bad for Democrats. They're really bad for cities. And I think it's really bad for the country because, first of all, cities are awesome. And second of all, I've come to the conclusion that you can't have the only way you're going to have two healthy parties is if you have two healthy parties. You can't have one healthy party and one crazy party. And what if you had to explain to somebody who knew nothing about this but was just reliably informed, what is it about, whether it's Portland or New York or pick your cities, what is it about them that makes it so difficult to, like, say, we really should do something about crime? Or, I mean, like, these like really obvious things that would be good for the citizens, good for their political careers. That, hey, maybe we shouldn't legalize using hardcore narcotics in downtown Portland. Like I don't, like, just assume I don't know anything about politics. What is your theory of the case about why this is so hard to just sort of be a moderate but forceful center left Democrat?
Yeah, well, and one argument is that we have seen over the past couple of years the willingness of voters to discipline elected officials in big cities when they go too far, which is how you get a guy like Daniel Lurie in San Francisco, who the Dispatch just did a good piece about, who sort of moved to the moderate left. That's how you ended up with Eric Adams the first time around. He's the mayor of New York City. He's about to lose re-election to a socialist, and it's probably because he is a victim of his own success. I.e., he came in, he eventually installed a competent NYPD commissioner, and she has successfully brought crime down. And now the issue is no longer salient, but previously,
he's also a
rising
little
crime,
corrupt, right? I mean,
yeah,
like, just a little,
what mayor of New York is not corrupt? Let's be clear. No, so actually, side note, you told me I'd go down a rabbit hole. Side note, we did a great Manhattan Institute, we did a focus group of New York City voters. And what I learned from that focus group is that the issue is not actually that he's corrupt. The issue is that he's associated with Donald Trump. And that makes him a complete non-starter to New York City voters.
Okay.
Sorry. So, it is the case that voters can discipline far left excesses when they happen. But I think that there are two models for how you can, think about public choice. Like the public politicians are rational actors; they pursue their own self-interest. There are two models for how you can pursue your own self-interest. One model, which I sort of think about as the logical model that many people think about, is like you can provide high quality services and an attractive economy and safety so that people come to your city and they build stuff there and you get tax revenue and everyone like celebrates you and they love your city and it's great. That's like the sort of competent governance leads to rewards model. That's one model. But it turns out that model is actually not the only equilibrium stable model. Another model that I like to think about is the California model is you can inherit a city that has a tremendous amount of intrinsic value. So like San Francisco is like this. San Francisco is one of the most beautiful cities in the United States. It's a great place to live. It's fantastic weather. Two, it has extraordinarily high concentrations of capital. And by that I mean like both dollars, but also like human capital. Like there are a huge number of smart people there. The network effects are really powerful. And we saw this during COVID. There were all these movements to like recenter Silicon Valley and Austin and Miami and several other places, and they completely failed because what the economists talk about is network effects. The benefits you get from clustering people together are just too strong to get people out of San Francisco. And so then you have a captured populace. And once that's true, the state or the local state formation, i.e. the city, doesn't necessarily have to provide high quality services to get people to stay there. In fact, it can become extractive, right? It can be like, there are all of these rich people here in San Francisco and we don't like them very much and they're not going to go anywhere. So we might as well tax them a bunch. We might as well try to extract a lot of money from them. And then also, instead of using that money to provide services they like, because they're going to stay here anyway, we can use that money in kickbacks to our local NGO friends who will then turn it into tents for the homeless people to sleep on the side of the street and do drugs on in the Tenderloin. And this will all be sustainable because people want to stay in the city in spite of the fact that it's really poorly governed. So, and by the way, that I should make this point, that model is often underwritten by federal dollars. So like in the city of New York, a huge fraction of the budget comes from federal Medicaid spending because Medicaid will underwrite large portions of the economy. And so the city can really coast on federal transit. Same thing is true of highway dollars. The city can really coast on federal dollars and not worry about alienating people. And then, by the way, this is the last point, you end up getting this sorting effect where if people don't like what you're doing to the city, they leave, and then they're not in the voting base anymore. And
Right.
so you get to remain in power because everyone who doesn't like you leaves. So my answer is like basically, why do cities fail with this sort of liberal style of governance? The answer is, in some senses, a really high quality city is at risk of is a parasitic government arrangement, and a parasitic government arrangement that is sustainable, is often underwritten by state and federal policymakers, and can sustain itself in part by virtue of how toxic it is. So, like,
Mm-hmm.
Chicago is a great example of this. Why is Chicago a once great, still in many ways a great American city, but certainly a once greater American city, been run into the ground? The answer is the state of Illinois keeps shouldering the costs and keeps expecting the feds to shoulder the costs of their irresponsible spending. They have a lot of intrinsic capital that they can sort of be parasitic on, and anytime people don't like it, they leave. And so as a result, it's like nobody imposed, the mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, is like a 5% approval rating.
Yeah.
But, he still is exercising power because that is a sustainable arrangement.
Yeah. I've been saying for years, like the sort of ideal Democratic candidate would be a sort of, for a lot of these cities, would be like a gay guy who was like a no nonsense kind of, like someone who gay or black guy who could immunize themselves in various ways against any identity politics kind of charges, and then just be like, no, we're actually, then be basically an abundance Democrat, right? I mean, I think that like there's such a space for that. And in many ways, that's what Giuliani was. I know he was technically a Republican, but he would have run as a Democrat if he could have. I mean, there was no problem with that. I mean, he was pretty liberal back then.
There were a whole bunch of mayors like this in the 1990s, right? So Giuliani is the canonical example, but Rick Riordan in LA, Ed Rendell in Philadelphia, one of the relevant Daley in Chicago, all of these like reformist mayors who came in and had the same playbook. They were all sort of like tough on crime, fiscal responsibility. The city is a mess, and we're going to clean it up. There was just this like moment. And this happens in the context of the cities have been getting worse and worse and worse for like 30 plus years, and like it becomes there is this great backlash, and it mostly succeeds, right? The cities become much safer. The population decline reverses. People start coming back. Like to refer to this focus group, we asked people to rank the mayors, and everyone had the strongest opinion of Mike Bloomberg. The ones who had been in the city, and they just remember what Bloomberg's New York was like, and it not only was safer, but it also felt safer. It felt more welcoming. It felt more like the kind of city that is desirable for families, for everyday normal people to live in. And so sometimes the like bad equilibrium gets bad enough that you get a backlash, you get this like disciplining effect, and you install a Giuliani. But also sometimes you need like a sort of persistent political push to say, no, really, we want you to do the hard thing of providing services, and we'll reward you for it. But like, that is not necessarily the path of least resistance in when the economy is good, when the federal tax dollars are flowing, when crime is declining for secular reasons. Like sometimes you just go for sort of the extractive model.
Just changing gears slightly, just because I never really thought about it until right now, and if I can't have an unexpressed thought on my own podcast, where can I? So, I think I have a pretty good grasp of what rural policy is, and I have a pretty solid grasp. I mean, more solid grasp on what urban policy is. But there are a lot of people who don't live in the cities, but who also don't live in like rural America, right?
Extra suburbs.
Yeah. So, like, what, like, if you ask me what the most pressing urban policy question was, I could guess at it, and I'd probably get close. Crime, homelessness, those kinds of things. And And if you ask me what the biggest rural one was, access to healthcare, that kind of thing, right? What is the one in the middle?
Hmm. I mean, I think the answer is okay. So, 80% of Americans live in quote unquote urban areas. That's the
Mm-hmm.
census's definition. Urban areas really just means you live
It's like a
in,
metro area, right?
yes, it's
So
a
yeah.
metro area. So, really, you live either in a city or in a suburb. If you live in a
Mm-hmm.
suburb, often it's the case that your job is in the city and you shifted out to the suburb because of the cost of living. So, you are trading transit time for the cost of your home, essentially.
Right. And
Um,
safety and maybe a
and
better
right,
school. Yeah.
yeah, so, right. I am currently speaking to you from the suburbs of Washington D.C. I don't live in Washington D.C., and that is for related reasons.
Yeah.
Um, I think though that set of constraints that is of concern to people in the cities is also of concern to people in the suburbs, and we tend the set of policies that are required are a little bit different, but they have to do essentially at the same level with how do we make this lifestyle affordable to people? How do we deal with the increased demand or the outflow from the cities or the inflow from there's a long period of time in American history where the trend was urbanization, where people flowed from farms into the cities. That was, the late 19th, early 20th century. And then in the middle of the 20th century, it became suburbanization. People flowed out of the cities into the suburbs. The suburbs have gotten bigger and bigger. So you have particularly in this gets a little bit into like the variation in laws at state level, but basically, particularly in the Sun Belt and the American Southwest, you have these steadily expanding suburbs where you need to be thinking about how do you provide utilities to somewhere that's 2 hours outside of Dallas, but still in the DFW
Yeah.
metro area. How do you keep that housing affordable? Is that sort of suburban sprawl good? There were a lot of people who would say no. I tend to say yes. That's a sort of controversial position in urbanist public policy. But I think that getting people to grow out is like a big part of how you build how you address the affordability crisis in housing, which is the core part of the affordability crisis. But then again, it's like, how do you build the transportation infrastructure? Should you just build more highways? Are the highways sustainable? Can you do mass transit? Who's going to pay for the mass transit? So a lot of it is basically just like, again, you're making that time versus money trade-off in order
Mm-hmm.
to get access. And the question becomes like, at a larger scale, how do you get people integrated into the urban economy? Can you do that? And then what are the costs associated with that? And then separately, how do you make those communities that are increasingly far from the urban center sustainable rather than just sort of like continuing to sprawl outwards forever unsustainably? So
All right.
that's like it is ultimately a planning challenge, and in some senses, as a good free marketeer, my attitude is like we don't need to plan it that much, but there are places where it ends up touching on the state where you have to make these decisions, and the question is, what do those decisions look like?
So, but it's funny. So, like, if just in listening to you, right? If when I said what are the most pressing public policy issues for cities, I said, crime, homelessness, drugs, whatever. I mean, like,
I would actually say it's affordability,
okay, that's
simply
fair.
as a matter of what the polling says. But yeah,
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. But the point I'm getting at is, if you were doing, let's say, you could do a heat map of the United States, and wherever there were large tangles of pathologies, in the Moynihan phrase, it was hotter. The heat map would kind of map. It wouldn't necessarily map population, right? Because it would get much cooler as you go into the suburbs, which is not to say everybody in the suburbs is doing great, but we're talking about the median person. It's going to be cooler on the pathology heat map, and then you go into rural America, and it's going to get hotter again. Um, uh, and this is not a slight on rural America, but like the fentanyl and meth and all sorts of things. There are real problems in parts of rural America. Is How to put this? Would the part of the if you solve the intensity of the heat problem in the cities, um, doesn't that clear away a lot of the other problems that we're talking about. Because I view cities as like historically one of the things that are great about cities is they're the place where poor people move to find work, and they were these great engines of social mobility, and they still are in big chunks of the world. Um, and so if you could fix the pathologies in the cities, that fixes a lot of the affordability stuff,
Yeah.
and a lot of the other problems too.
Yeah, well, so okay, there were a bunch of different moving parts there. One is sort of like the concentration of pathology in rural America, which in some senses, and your colleague Kevin Williamson has written about this among others, is in some senses a selection phenomenon, right? It's just
Mm-hmm.
like if you can get out of rural America, you do, and so the people who are left behind are the people who
Right.
can't get out, and often they don't have employment. Manufacturing has moved overseas. Also, drugs are really cheap now, and like so, the thing is, you do a lot of drugs, and that's not like I don't ultimately think I think that's about the drugs rather than about the economic the economic dislocation, but like that compositional effect I think ends up explaining a lot of it. In terms of addressing the social pathology in cities, I guess the way that I think about this is like there are a core problem for any community, any group of people, any political, any polity is like, how do you get people to get along? How do people cooperate? How do you facilitate cooperation? How do you suppress antisocial behavior? If you live out in the middle of nowhere, your solution to that problem is basically space. Like
Mm-hmm.
you have your 40 acres and nobody's going to mess with you on your 40 acres. And like maybe you see the neighbors sometimes, but you'll basically know each other. If you live in a small local community, your solution to that problem is basically shared norms. Like everybody kind of knows each other. We all have the same rules and we all get along. And that is a stable solution. Neither of those works in cities. Cities are characterized by very soft or loose networks of informal social control. You don't know most of the people you pass on the street. The way, and this is an argument that comes from Jane Jacobs, who's the
Mm-hmm.
urbanist who wrote Life and Death of Great American Cities. It's a classic work of urbanism. The way that cities regulate themselves is instead of doing the sort of tight network, like tight sets of norms that everybody knows, what they do is they just have sort of very loose informal social control all the time. And her argument is about variety. It's basically like to have a successful city, you have to be using every space for many different functions so that the space is constantly surveilled and constantly engaged with by the population. This is her concept of eyes on the street. Why am I talking about this? I think that if you want to address, if you want to restore cities to being effective engines of opportunity, a lot of what has decayed in cities, both over the past 5 to 10 years, but also in some senses over the past 60 to 70 years, is that informal network of social control that facilitates people's ability to sort of integrate themselves into the city economy while suppressing people's, the behavior of antisocial people that alienates people from the city. And that is not the whole part of the story. Like if you asked me how do you address affordability in the city, my first and most exhaustive answer is that you need to legalize building stuff, and that is just like
Mm-hmm.
a major constraint on all American cities and an enormous problem. But also, if you want to sort of get at making pathological communities better, a lot of it comes down to the ability of those communities to regulate their own behavior through this sort of like informal system. And that system has been really thoroughly gutted, both by cultural changes and by legal changes and by shifts in the population, and by shifts in public policy. There's a whole history there. So I think changing that doesn't necessarily fix, it does make the city more attractive. Some people desurbanize, some people start to flow in from rural areas. In some senses, I think people will do that anyway, but it does also, it makes addressing those sort of concentrations of pathology that are so socially toxic and so deterrent to somebody like me who lives in the suburbs. It makes it much easier if you can get to sort of that core how do cities manage themselves question, and we also don't talk about that question is the last thing I would say.
Yeah, no. Just I mean, we can close out on the cities because I want to get to sports gambling. And listeners should know this might not air until next week, but um, this is the second to last podcast I will be recording before I win Powerball tonight. So the gambling conversation will be a little hypocritical in retrospect, but so be it. Um, But just one last point on the city stuff. My brother, my late brother, he once ran for city council in New York and did spectacularly poorly. But he kind of went to school on New York City politics, and it sent me down a rabbit hole because he would tell me things. And um, um, it has always been one of my biggest beefs with the rhetoric about voter suppression and Jim Crow 2.0 and Georgia and all this kind of stuff. That and there's some great political science on this stuff. That among the most determined forces for suppressing or limiting turnout in elections are big city public sector unions, because if the turnout is only 5% and all the public sector union and affiliated allies show up, they are the decider in any election. If everybody turned up, they're a rounding error because there aren't that many of them, and so and the they talk a big game about public financing of elections, but the public financing stuff is so onerous and so difficult. You actually need a full-time legislative staff to navigate it. So it's really an incumbency protection thing, even though supposedly they're funding your opponents. And so for me, like I it used to sound really hypocritical or really self-serving for me when I was much more rah-rah for the Republicans. But I still have the same position, even though I now am not exactly, rah-rah for Republicans. Is that if people ask me how to vote in any city, I don't want to know almost anything about what's going on. I just want to know, has one party been in control for a very long time? And if so, vote them out. Because competition in politics would be good for any of these places, better than any specific public policy thing.
Yeah, well, and there are lots of arguments where I'm persuaded of sort of the virtue of more conventionally progressive electoral reform ideas, which I'm sort of skeptical of on the national level. I'm often find very appealing on the local level, because take a city like New York. 25 to 30% of New Yorkers are Republicans. There are like 6 Republicans on the city council. That is less than 25 to 30%
Mm-hmm.
of New Yorkers. If you shift to a proportional voting system in New York, then you are more likely to get a more representative sample. You're more likely to get the broader spectrum.
Right.
On the other hand, and I just want to tell this story because it's a great example. Okay, New York is undergoing a revision of its city charter. They just had a charter revision commission make a series of recommendations. One of the recommendations that that the Charter Revision Commission floated and got knocked down was to move to a top 2 primary system, which is basically you have a nonpartisan open primary, anyone can run, and then the top 2 candidates proceed to the general. Then this would be good for sort of like, the minority view in New York. You'd be more likely to have a more conservative and more right of center candidate advance to the second slot. Many of the labor unions in the city opposed this, but most amusingly, New York's Working Families Party, which is a third party in the city of New York, was opposed to this. And the reason for this is that they had worked out that they could have more influence in the Democratic primary because their preferred candidate, Zohran Mamdani, just won the Democratic primary. They can have more influence in the Democratic primary under the current system, with that smaller pool of voters involved than they can have in an open primary. And so you had members of the Working Families Party coming to the city council, to the Charter Revision Commission, and berating them because they were like, no, we absolutely do not want to have more access to the primary. We want less access. We want our registered voters to be disenfranchised because it will be good for us. It was an incredible moment.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
All right. So you did a great piece for us on online on sports gambling and the legalization of it, and it's music to my ears. I've been saying this is going to end badly for a very long time. I would like it to be fixed before it gets as bad as I think it's going to be. But why don't you sort of lay out where we are and what your thesis is and all that?
Yeah, I mean, and I've been writing about sports gambling for a little while, and it dovetails with one of my other professional interests, which is what I think about very broadly as vice and the regulation thereof,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very sort of abstract concept. But I'm interested in hard drugs. I'm interested in marijuana. I've written for the Dispatch about pornography, and I've
That
read about
clip is going
sports
to be
gambling.
taken out of context, dude. But go on.
That's okay. No, I had a piece with you guys about how you can totally prosecute Pornhub, like they're violating federal law right now, and they could do
Yeah.
it. It was a fun piece. No, so gambling is a really interesting example to me because it is one of the most high salience cases of ending a prohibition. Right, we don't do that a lot. There are a lot of prohibited vices. We've sort of been like piecemeal ending the prohibition on marijuana, but like gambling, we just ended the prohibition all at once. It was illegal from sports gambling was illegal from 1992 to 2018 when the Supreme Court said the federal ban was unconstitutional, and now it's legal in 40 plus states.
Yeah.
I think it's 40 states in DC. That like, and I think many of your listeners have probably noticed this like phenomenon of if you think back 10 years, you didn't hear anything about sports gambling, and now it's everywhere. It's at the sporting events. It's at, if you watch ESPN, they're talking about the lines on air. ESPN actually has its own sports book.
Yeah.
And that's my argument in the piece is basically people are increasingly waking up to how bad this has gotten. I point to what I consider to be some pretty high quality research, and you can do high quality research because basically sports gambling was implemented in different states at different times after the Supreme Court ruling, and so you can compare states with and without it before and after, and that lets you really isolate the effects. And when you do that, you get, I'm just going to give you, some of the numbers I point to in the piece. Legalization, a quadrupling of irresponsible gambling, a 75% increase in calls to gambling helplines, increased credit card debt and risk of overdraft, increases the risk of bankruptcy by 25 to 30%. There's also evidence of connections to anxiety, depression, suicidality, and even domestic violence. And by the way, to get back to this tangle pathology themes, all of those harms concentrate among young, often financially precarious men. Those are the people who are most at risk, and that makes a lot of intuitive sense. And then also, I think you've seen there are an ever-growing number of sports gambling related controversies or scandals, and they've not quite been big enough to like really break through. I thought we were almost there with the Shohei Ohtani story, and then they were like, "No, it's the translator," and I'm like, "Okay, I believe you."
Yeah.
But I think that there is increasing demand for something to be done about this, and I have argued, and I'm happy to make the argument here that the regulatory solution is unlikely to work, and therefore we should just prohibit it again. I am in the minority in thinking that because I'm an old school prohibitionist on many fronts. But I think that there are regulatory steps that you theoretically could take that would be popular that would like really curb a lot of the harms that we should really be talking about. This gets into the broader point of like, I think that there is a more general increase in the availability, and I've written for you guys about this as well. There's a more general increase in the availability of addictive, vicious products, vice products that we Americans are sort of starting to get uncomfortable with. We're like, maybe this was not so great. Maybe these like great experiments were not going so well. So that's that's the core of the argument.
Well, I want to stay on the gambling stuff, but it is amazing. I was just talking to somebody about this. Actually, I was talking to Scott Jennings at CNN about this. I don't think we're supposed to be. It was green room conversation supposed to stay in the green room, but I think this is fine. And I was like, if you were going to design a series of policies to screw with young men on the bubble, maybe not college educated, or maybe partial, community college kids, or kids who could go either way, let's say, in their lives, and in a very short period of time, introduce them to unlimited online porn, totally legalized marijuana, and full access to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, online gambling on their phones. You would not say that you're particularly concerned with the plight of young men at the crossroads, as it were. And yet that's exactly what we've done. I mean, it is amazing to me. Like, I often give these speeches to, there's life advice to young kids about how there's no such thing as wasted time. Like if you go work at a job as a ditch digger for a year, that's great experience that you'll find more useful than you realized years later. And I always say the one thing that is not that is actually wasted time is spending all day on your couch playing Call of Duty. But even that's more monetizable than watching porn or gambling. Um, and and yet, like I just don't see any constituency out there. I don't see any political constituency that is having much success in doing anything about this stuff.
Yeah. So this is the rub. Like I'm professionally against fun, and the people who are on my coalition are exactly what you'd expect from the anti-fun coalition. And on the other hand, like people do recognize that the exact set of problems that you're talking about, and it is intuitive, right? Like the thing I like to say is like you and I both know intuitively how those young men are thinking because we were both once
Yeah,
young
for
men,
sure.
and I was quite stupid. I assume you were quite stupid also, like just as young men are. That is a key part of being a young man, and so it's like as you allude to, free unlimited marijuana, pornography, sports gambling. It's just like, is it going to kill them? No. Is it going to mean that they waste large portions of their lives? Yes. There
Right.
are, not to. There are something like half of men 18 to 49 have a gambling account. There are like 18 million daily or near daily marijuana users. You can't get reliable survey statistics on pornography because everyone lies, but
Right.
like there are a lot of them. No, and so I think the point the challenge is getting people to care. The reality is that Americans, I say this and sounds very cynical, but I think it's just descriptively true. Americans don't care about addicts. Like they
Mm-hmm.
aren't invested in because we're a very laissez-faire country. In many ways, that's what makes us a great country. But it means that we look at people making choices to ruin their own lives, and like that's their problem. And I can sort of show you the scary statistics, and sometimes that persuades if you're primed to persuade, but you don't really care. And so you do have to ultimately talk about social harms. Like that is what ends up persuading people, and has always ended up persuading people about vice as a product. I talk in the Dispatch piece about one of the most successful anti-vice initiatives is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Right?
Mm-hmm.
They passed a number of very successful zero tolerance laws. By the way, we have evidence that those actually do reduce traffic fatalities. They really do work. And what happened is that one mom's daughter, Candy Lightner's daughter, Carrie, got hit by a drunk driver and died. And she was like, I'm not putting up with this. This is a terrible issue. And she started finding other moms who had the same experience. And they formed Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And it was an astonishingly successful political organization. But so what you have to do is you basically have to say, like, it hurts kids. It's unpleasant to be around. It is in some other ways socially toxic. So, like, on the porn front, there was just this win at the Supreme Court. Paxton, which I wrote for the Dispatch about,
Mm-hmm.
Paxton Free Speech Coalition, where the Supreme Court said, yes, you can age gate access to pornography. That is constitutionally listed, doesn't violate the First Amendment. But that was like, it's about the kids. With, people, when you talk about pot, the thing that people hate is the smell. They cannot stand the smell.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of like, that's really the thing that gets you, but
Right.
okay. Like if that's
Yeah.
what persuades you, that's what persuades you.
Yeah.
With sports gambling, it's a little harder because it is entirely focalized. I do think that there is a fairness argument that people find persuasive. Two things. One is that people hate the ads. People
Mm-hmm.
cannot stand the constant chatter about sports gambling. There's polling on if you did a buzzer to buzzer ban on sports gambling ads, and it's like 60+% of Americans would be in favor of it. But then the other thing is like, people do have a sense that some of what the sports books do is unfair.
Mm-hmm.
If you are too good, they will kick you off. Like if you are net positive, they will kick you off the sports
Mm-hmm.
book because that like maximizes their profits. And you can get people to say, yeah, that shouldn't be allowed. They will algorithmically target you to try to encourage you to make worse bets.
Mm-hmm.
People feel like that's unfair. People feel like that's not an acceptable, great business practice because they can imagine it affecting themselves, right? They can
Right.
imagine themselves getting hurt by it. So, like,
So when you say
I think
algorithmically target you to make worse bets, it's some sort of nudge? Like, do you really think this guy's going to make this 3-pointer? I mean, like, what is the actual
it's like
prompt?
I mean, the answer is like every time. I mean, it's more insidious than that because every time you interact with the app, you're getting the sportsbook is getting information about you, and then you just take all that data and you feed it into an LLM, you feed it into AI, and it goes, oh yeah, he is most likely to bet between the hours of 12:03 a.m. and 12:10 a.m. So you should do a pop up then, and he, on Thursdays he's more likely to take a parlay, so you should prompt him to give him parlays then, and you should give him a 5% discount so he makes a bad bet then, and you can, like, they have millions of users worth of data, so it's trivial to discern the patterns. And so it's like everybody knows when they go to Vegas that you can't beat the house, and you're sort of
Mm-hmm.
like doing it knowing that. But like not everybody who is using these apps knows that they can't beat the house. And more to the point, the house is just way smarter.
Mm-hmm.
Like the advantage that the house has is overwhelmingly greater than it is in Vegas. And the result of this is like when you explain this, people they go, oh yeah, that doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem like a fair way to treat people in this business.
Um, yeah, the ban on advertising seems like a no-brainer to me. I mean, particularly during the games, right? But I mean, I'm older than you. I have been a quasi neo-prohibitionist on many things for a very long time. One of my biggest arguments at National Review back in the day was I was one of the only ones who was pretty vocally disagreeing with our editorial policy about the drug war. And part of my argument was, this whole model that you were referring to about how America doesn't care about addicts, it comes from this sort of classical liberal libertarian point of view that says everybody's a rational actor. And that is true. And there is something, so I'm very much a caveat emptor thing about material goods that you purchase. But having had a brother who ultimately died from his addictions, like I can testify firsthand. My brother was very, 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 very smart. He knew what the right things to do were and could not muster the will to do them. I've known a lot of addicts in my life, some gambling, a lot about booze and drugs and whatnot. And the problem is that there are certain drugs that make you a non-rational actor. And so it's sort of like asking someone, do you agree that if you signed a contract, you're on a contract? Yes. Do you agree that if you sign a contract and there's small print in the contract that says this is binding for the rest of your life, you cannot escape because I am the devil, and it's going to require you to like sell off your family and do all these things that you didn't think you were getting in return for a fun night. And this drives a lot of libertarian guys crazy. People I respect and admire, but they don't believe it because in some part of the problem with a lot of libertarians, and I love libertarians, I've become much more libertarian, is that they have the kind of personality type that let them successfully use recreational drugs.
Correct.
And come out on the other side as successful people. And so they think if I can do it, so can everybody else. And that has more to do with the fact that they're the ENTJ types who are libertarians than it has to do with like that their anecdata is representative, because most people aren't like them. And certainly there are a lot of addicts that prove them wrong.
Yes. No, and there are a bunch of different ways to frame this, and in some senses, I vary this by audience, right? Like if I'm talking to a liberal audience, I will just say the words consumer protection a bunch, and like slowly but steadily, they start to nod along. I'm like, oh yeah, there was a consumer protection reason to prohibit marijuana, and I'm like, sure, whatever, that persuades you. I mean, I do kind of think that that's true, although I don't love the phrase consumer protection in other contexts for the reasons you enumerated. There are I think two other ways. One is the way of thinking about it, which is like bounded rationality, right? It's like, and this is sort of an insight from behavioral economics of there are certain conditions in which our otherwise rational behavior breaks down, and one of them is if you choose to do something that subsequently makes you irrationally incapable of not doing the thing, of not stopping doing the thing, right? If you choose to do the first dose, that can be theoretically a rational choice, except then you will subsequently be inhibiting your rationality to stop doing, to make the decision about what is in your interest. Like one sort of economistic model of how addiction works is a product is addictive, to use some really technical language, product is addictive if it's an autocorrelated term in the utility function. What that means is, in plain English, is a product is addictive if the more you use it, the more reward you get from using it, such that it can end up crowding out the benefits of doing things that other than it. And like over the long run, it can be rational to optimize away from that because you would like lose other things, like if the term decays. But over the short run, it can always be rational to keep dosing because like that is what gives you the most reward right then. And so that that messes with, that bounds your rationality, that messes with your rationality, means that the optimal decision making is not necessarily the same in the short run and the long run. That's a very sort of behavioral economics way to think about it. And then the other thing that I say that I really think is true to your point about like sort of high self control, high intrinsic self control people, it is the case that like no product is perfectly addictive, right? My
Sure.
go-to example of this is the meta-analytic estimate is only about 30% of heroin initiates will proceed to regular addictive use, which means like if you shoot heroin, don't do heroin, listeners, please.
Right.
If you shoot heroin today, like you got a 7 in 10 chance of being fine. And heroin's allegedly fun. Again, please do not do heroin. And if you do, don't blame me. Um, but like all addictive products are like that. Only 5 to 10% of people who sports gamble have a problem, right? Most people who sports gamble are going to be fine with it. Same thing with pot. Most people, it turns out that like pot is sort of bimodal, where either you use every day or you use sometimes and then you get over it.
Mm-hmm.
Alcohol is the same way. 5 to 10% of alcohol users, so the overwhelming majority of consumers. This is just sort of how vice products work. And so the question is like, why should we be invested as a community in the plight of the 5 to 10%? And again, one answer is consumer protection. One answer is the sort of bounded economics. Another answer, and I think the answer that I find most deeply intuitively persuasive as conservative, is we live in a republic that is dependent upon certain notions of self-governance, right? We are a democracy. We rule ourselves together, and government can deprive us of that through tyranny, but certain products can actually also tyrannize us in an analogous way by depriving us of our self-control, or depriving us of our independent volition, by enslaving us to those products, which is to say, from if you believe that the American Republic is made for virtuous people, and you recognize that sobriety is a virtue, not necessarily abstinence, but sobriety is a virtue, temperance is a virtue, then you should recognize addictive, harmful substances as an active threat to that virtue, as vicious, and therefore as imperiling our ability to be self-governing. And so therefore you can say, insofar as the state is obliged, the federal government is obliged to ensure a Republican form of government, the state has a legitimate interest in making sure that we can be self-governing. The same justification for public education can also be used to say, we should prohibit these products because they are making us less able to govern ourselves.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm curious what you think about this. So like, I think that one of the real challenges for public policy these days is dealing with is losing the benefits of technological limitations. Like, there are always porn mags and porn movies and stuff, but there was a certain amount of effort that went into getting them. You had to like go to the video store and go into move the curtain and go to the embarrassing part of the room, and then you had to risk. Like, I once, when I lived in DuPont Circle, I once got the Vin Diesel movie, which the title was Triple X, and when I tried to take out another movie, the guy was like, "You still have an outstanding movie. You still owe us one of these adult," and it was like in front of a whole family of people. And they're like, "You have an adult movie that you have a porn movie still." And I was like, "No, I don't." It's like, "Well, it says right here, Triple X." And I was like, "No, that's a Vin Diesel." Anyway, but like the fear of like stigma, or be embarrassed, or like asking for the magazine that they keep behind the counter. Same thing with gambling. I was always fine with gambling in Atlantic City and Vegas. I just wanted it to be a little hard, like it was a special occasion thing to do, right? And the problem we face now is that the natural limitations that technology and distance imposed, that said, the 5 to 10% of people you're talking about that really want to do this as a full-time thing, those outlets used to exist. It was hard and they self-sorted, and now it's those buffers are gone, and it is accessible from anywhere at any time. You don't have to get off your couch in many respects. I mean, it used to be the coolest thing in the world in the 1980s when I was a teenager. Like, there were these guys, it was like literally called like dial-a-weed, where you can call up everyone thought it was the craziest thing. I am sure that like weed delivery is just a huge thing now, like for real. Like before, part of it was transgressive and cool because it was illegal, and And the weed is so much stronger today than it was in back. So anyway, my point is like policymakers need to make arguments for things that life used to provide for them.
Yeah. So okay. So there are two different components there, and they're both important. One is this sort of secular increase in potency, and so you talked about National Review's editorial line on the war on drugs. That comes in part from arguments advanced by a guy named Richard Cowan, who wrote an article for NR called "The Iron Law of Prohibition." And Cowan's argument, very nice guy, by the way. I've talked to him. I don't agree with him about anything. He's a nice guy. And Cowan's argument was basically prohibition increases the intensity of the potency of product. And I can make the argument. I have argued, and I think that this is the dominant effect, that there's also what we struck it as the iron law of liberalization, which is that the less prohibited a product is, the more potent it gets. And you see this with marijuana, you see this with pornography, you see this with sports gambling. And this is actually just downstream of the fact that markets are really efficient. They're really good at innovating. And if prohibition restrains the market, it's a regulation on the market. It makes it inefficient and work poorly. If you take that off, then the market will give consumers what they want, right? It will give, and the thing they want is more potency, which is why you get high potency weed.
And they'll see comparative advantage by refining the depravity of the porn or 100 other things.
And specifically because these are addictive products, the large majority of consumption, the large majority of sales go to a small fraction of users. And so you're competing for the guy who's addicted, not for like the guy who wants to smoke a joint on the weekends and otherwise he doesn't matter to your product. Okay, but here's the second point is the other half of what you're talking about is the concept of taboo, right? And this is to return to neocons, this is a very Irving Kristol point. Kristol wrote about pornography, and sort of said like you do want it to just like you're not ever going to successfully expel it from society, right? It's temperance, not like absolute sobriety. It's not teetotaling. You're never going to get rid of it, but you want to isolate it. You want to make it taboo. And then the question is like, why aren't these products taboo? And the answer is that like they're used to your point about it's prohibited, so it's like transgressive. The law is actually a very important part of making products taboo, even when it is not otherwise very aggressively enforced. Simply the elocution, this is illegal. I think about this in the context of pornography. We have this whole category in American law, in American free speech law, which is the obscene, right? And it's like, there's a whole definition in the Constitutional Court in the 1970s of what obscenity is. This, when you see it, that's an earlier case. But we do not, as a society, really think about that as a moral category anymore. It's a category that exists theoretically in law, but is never actually used. We don't have moral public discussions about, is it a problem if something is obscene? Right now, we talk about these sort of like harm concepts of like, porn is bad because it hurts the actors, which is true. Porn is bad because it could hurt children, which is true. We don't talk about it as bad in itself. The same thing is true of, is gambling bad in itself? Is gambling individually harmful such that the state should prohibit it on its own terms? Again, the one argument against this is that can have undesirable costs. That prohibitions have been putting people in prison, and the answer is like often that laws that enforce taboos are often not aggressively enforced. Sports gambling was illegal between 1992 and 2018, and there were like several hundred associated arrests a year. It's just like a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. But simply, we have stepped back from the idea that the state should make elocutions about there are things that people ought not to do. There are things that ought to be taboo. And because we've lost that sort of policy lever, we've lost the cultural lever as well. So that that's the other half of the equation is not only do we authorize this sort of innovation process, we also say, we're not going to formally discourage this through what is historically the means by which we discourage it in a common law system, which is saying you can't do it.
Right. It was funny. I remember the first time I used to do a lot of college campus speaking, and I used to go out with the kids afterwards for a beer or whatever. And I remember the first time
I should say my wife was once one of those kids.
Oh, is that right?
She told me she told me to say, remind him of the time that he bought us all drinks.
Oh, there you go. I figure it's part of my Buckleyite mission to bring the word to the people. And where did she go to school? Out of curiosity.
Yale.
Okay. Did we go to the Owl?
Yes, you did.
Oh, wow. Okay. Very cool. Where was I? Oh, I think it was at Davidson, and I asked this kid. It was like, why aren't you drinking? And what? I was like, you can grab a beer, and he was like, well, I don't. It's okay. And I was like, oh, okay. Just curious, like why? Like I wasn't grilling him or interrogating him. And after a little discussion, it turned out it wasn't religious. It wasn't anything like that. And it wasn't that he didn't like beer. It was just that it was illegal, and that it would go because he was 20, and it could go on his permanent record. And now, when I was in high school, I would be inclined to give someone a wedgie if they told me something like that. But in this context, I think it's illustrative of the fact that there are a lot of people who poo-poo this idea that people don't do things because they're illegal. But it turns out there are a lot of people who actually do think the law is normative, and has value to it. But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
The very concrete example I like to think about is so I live in I live in suburban Maryland, and if you go outside of my house right now, there's some bikes sitting outside. And the interesting question to me is like, why don't people steal my bikes? And the answer is like, you live in a nice place. And my response to this is, okay, but if somebody stole my bike, like it would be a rational thing for them to do. It would be logical for them to steal my bike. They would benefit a bike. Their risk of apprehension is essentially zero. Like I can show you the clearance rates. I'm not getting my bike back. And so my question there is just like, why is there not way more random theft? Why does that not happen way more than it does? Like I see unprotected things all the time. I'm like, somebody could steal that, but they don't. Why don't they? It would be rational for them to do so. And the answer to that question is most people follow the law not because they are worried about the consequences, but because the law has intrinsic legitimacy, right? Mm-hmm. This is not, by the way, true of like the majority of offending is done by people who don't care about legitimacy, and you have to think about like how to deter those people, and that's most of what criminal justice policy is about. But like the large majority of people who don't offend do so because they view the law as a legitimate institution, and they think that the elocutions of the state matter for what is right and what is wrong. They know they know that stealing is bad in itself, but they also know that there is something wrong about contravening the law. And indeed, there are laws that don't work like that as well because the crime is not malum se. Lots of people drink under the age of 21. I was once one of those people, as shocking as that may be. But even then, to your guy's point, it is a taboo act. It is a right. thing that everybody does, but that everybody sort of like knows they need to sneak around and be a little bit cautious about. And, you don't
use
quite get
bag.
everything that you would want. Yeah. You have to use a brown bag. There is some, this is I think it's the Oscar Wilde line, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. There is some sense that there is something that we need to be a little cautious about. And that is, that is the retarding function of taboo, is it's saying, even if you're going to do this, even if you're going to gamble, if you're going to gamble, you need to go down to the OTB, or you need to go to Vegas, you need to go to Atlantic City. If you're going to watch porn, you need to buy it from the store in like a sketchy part of town. If you want to smoke pot, you need to be able to get it from some guy. All of which is ultimately suppressive of both the extent of use, but also the intensity of use and indeed the embrace of use. All of it just makes it sort of like a little bit less. And I think we've lost the ability to sort of recognize the virtue in that.
All right. Unfortunately, I had not realized that we could just go to town on the virtues of prohibition. I'll have you back to continue this, but I actually have another podcast I got to record in just a second. So we're gonna have to end it here. It was Rochefoucauld who said vice is the virtue, hypocrisy thing. But thank you very much for doing this, and we'll definitely have you back. And thank you for being a contributor to the Dispatch.